Today, we're diving into a classic book about the patterns of American politics. It's called The Cycles of American History, and it's all about America's national destiny. Here's what this book discovered. Over the past 100-plus years, America's domestic and foreign policies, and even the national mood, have shifted dramatically every 15 years. Like clockwork, America, it turns out, behaves a lot like a person with bipolar disorder. Every 15 years, it swings from let's all get together and do something great, that fired-up manic mode, to, you know what, let's just each look after ourselves, that cold, withdrawn, depressive mode. 15 years manic, 15 years depressive. Add them together, and you get a 30-year cycle. Take the beginning of the 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt leads a whole country through progressive era reforms. 30 years later, FDR launches the New Deal. 30 years after that, JFK rolls out the New Frontier. Each time, a president arrives right on schedule, full of energy, ready to lead the whole nation towards something big. And sandwiched between them, the 1920s under Harding and Coolidge, the 1950s under Eisenhower, the 1980s under Reagan. Each time, a completely different national mood. The whole country collectively exhales, sets public affairs aside, and gets back to making money. See how precisely that pendulum swings? Now, you might say, isn't this just Democrats and Republicans taking turns? Actually, no. And we'll get to why the cycle runs deeper than party loyalty. The man who noticed this pattern and wrote this book is Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a historian who served as special assistant to President Kennedy and won the Pulitzer Prize twice. So here's the core insight. When it comes to which direction America should go, there have always been two roughly equal forces pulling against each other. Neither can permanently defeat the other. And that, Schlesinger argues, is actually America's great fortune. Think of it like a car driving along a narrow mountain road with cliffs on both sides. Veer too far in either direction, and you go over the edge. Now imagine that car has two drivers, both pretty decent, sitting side by side. The car drifts left. The right side driver corrects. It drifts right. The left side driver corrects. They're constantly arguing, constantly fighting over the wheel. But that very tension, that evenly matched struggle, is what's kept the car from flying off either cliff for over 100 years. That's what I call America's national fortune. In much of the rest of the world, it doesn't work this way. Either one ideology dominates for decades, or whoever gets the wheel suddenly yanks it 90 degrees, left or right, and the car goes off the cliff. And it takes a very long time to climb back up. America's situation has been genuinely lucky. Lucky at a civilizational level. So, who are these two drivers? Why are they so evenly matched? What keeps pulling the losing side back? And why is the cycle exactly 30 years? All of this comes from Schlesinger's book. Let's get into it. Schlesinger's framework is fascinating. He says the car doesn't just have two drivers fighting up front. There are also two passengers in the back seat who don't much like each other either. The two drivers are called the public purpose America and the private interest America. The two backseat passengers are called the experimental America and the providential America. The passengers don't drive, but anyone who's ever had a backseat driver knows. They absolutely affect the mood up front. America's national spirit is shaped by all four. Let's start with the drivers. Driver 1, public purpose. This half of America believes that the country's big problems, breaking up monopolies, solving racial injustice, winning the Cold War, cannot be solved by individuals and markets alone. So everyone needs to get together, unite, and accomplish something as a nation. The progressive era at the start of the 20th century, dismantling the trusts. FDR's New Deal in the 30s and 40s, building Social Security. Kennedy's New Frontier in the 60s, sending Peace Corps volunteers to Africa, spending a generation's worth of tax dollars to put 2 Americans on the moon for a couple of hours. These massive, collective undertakings are the handiwork of public purpose America. In this mode, the president isn't just an administrator. He's the spiritual leader of the whole nation. He's there to lead everyone towards something great, which is why JFK, a quintessential public purpose president, could say those famous words, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. That energy, that sense of collective mission, that feeling that makes you want to cry in the best way. Driver 2, private interest. This half of America holds the exact opposite belief. The more government does, the more it screws things up. You take care of yourself, I'll take care of myself, and together we'll produce the best outcome for society. President Coolidge said something in the 1920s that people have been laughing at for 100 years. The business of America is business, but in private interest America, that's not a punchline. That's just the way things are. Reagan upgraded it in his 1981 inaugural address. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. In private interest America, the best president is practically invisible. His job isn't to lead everyone toward a distant horizon. His job is to stand aside and let people get on with making money. So you have two Americas, two types of presidents, two completely different national atmospheres. In the 1920s and 1950s, the streets are full of ads, and the hot topic is who just got a new refrigerator. In the 1930s and 1960s, the whole country is gathered around the radio or the television, listening to president's fireside chat, with a sense of national mobilization in the air. Public purpose and private interest. Those are the two ends of the 30-year pendulum. Now, why does the pendulum have to swing? Why can't either side just stay in place? If the Harding-Coolidge government get out of my way approach was so great, why did FDR sweep the Republicans out in 1933? And if the New Deal was so good, why did Eisenhower beat the Democrats so easily in 1952? Schlesinger's answer: each side carries the seeds of its own destruction. How does public purpose destroy itself? Simple, people get tired. Public purpose puts the whole country into a state of high-intensity mobilization. In FDR's first 100 days, Congress passed 15 major laws, every one of them capable of seriously disrupting your life. Kennedy's New Frontier asked you to go volunteer in Africa, march in civil rights protests, and commit yourself to land the Americans on the moon. Every single initiative demanded your passion, your time, your patience. But people aren't perpetual motion machines. Woodrow Wilson said himself in 1919, "Only once in a generation can a people be lifted above material things." And he was right. By 1920, after 20 years of progressive era activism, World War I, and Wilson's own crusade to make the world safe for democracy, Americans were done. When Warren Harding won the presidency that year, he captured the national mood perfectly. We don't want heroics. We want healing. We don't want revolution. We want normalcy. That was the antidote to a national nervous breakdown. We're exhausted. We need a rest. How does private interest destroy itself? Schlesinger says, problems accumulate. Government get out of the way. Feels great in the short term. Low taxes, minimal regulation. Everyone focused on making money. But it only works if markets can actually handle everything on their own. And a lot of things markets simply cannot handle. In the 1920s, while everyone was busy making money, banks were busy making reckless loans. The stock market was busy speculating. The wealth gap was quietly growing. Nobody was managing any of this because government had gotten out of the way. And in October 1929, all of it exploded at once. That's the Great Depression. There always comes a tipping point, a triggering event, and the problems that build up, problems the invisible hand couldn't solve, force government back in. The pendulum snaps back to public purpose. So the engine of the American pendulum is internal contradiction on both sides. Public purpose exhausts people, snaps back to private interest. Private interest lets problems pile up until they explode, snaps back to public purpose. Each side contains its own reversal mechanism. Now, why is this a better explanation than just the parties take turns? Because the cycle runs deeper than party loyalty. Schlesinger gives several great examples. William Howard Taft, the conservative Republican who took office in 1908. By party logic, he should have opposed Teddy Roosevelt's agenda. Instead, Taft brought more antitrust cases than Roosevelt. Why? Because the public purpose wave was still surging. He couldn't have stopped it even if he'd tried. Nixon, Republican, so presumably cut taxes, shrink government. Instead, he created the Environmental Protection Agency, signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act, proposed a guaranteed minimum income, and oversaw the fastest growth in social welfare spending in history. Why? Because the public wave Kennedy and LBJ had set in motion in the 60s hadn't subsided yet. Nixon had to ride it. Carter, Democrat, but he deregulated industries and balanced the budget. Policies identical to what Reagan would do right after him. Why? Because by the late 70s, the pendulum was already swinging toward private interest. He couldn't stop it either. So party labels are like coats. You can put on a red coat or a blue coat. But whether the person wearing it is acting from public purpose or private interest, that's determined by where the pendulum is, not by the color of the coat. Schlesinger also notes that this cycle doesn't sync with the economic cycle either. Yes, the Great Depression triggered the New Deal, but the Progressive Era, another famous public purpose period, began during prosperity. No crisis sparked it. And in the late 19th century, America endured two major recessions back-to-back, and neither one reversed the private interest mood of that era. The pendulum has its own rhythm. So what does drive that rhythm? Why is it 30 years? Did the two sides agree on a schedule? Here's one of the most brilliant insights in the book. The answer is, it takes roughly 15 years for a generation of politicians to rise to power. And political values tend to skip a generation. Let me explain. In America and most Western democracies, people start having some political influence around age 30. But at 30, you're still challenging a generation that already holds power. You don't really get your hands on the wheel until around 45, when you finally push the previous generation aside. Then 15 years later, around 60, the next generation pushes you aside. So each generation holds power for about 15 years. 2 generations, 30 years. Now, here's the really interesting part. When you're 45 and finally in power, whose political vision are you trying to realize? Not the vision you formed at 40, not even at 30. Your political identity was formed when you were about 15 years old, in adolescence. Think about it. Isn't that when you first started feeling something about politics? Research backs this up. Our aesthetic tastes in music, film, fashion, all crystallized during adolescence. Political taste works the same way. Whoever was at the center of national power when you were a teenager, whoever was changing the world, making history, shaping the nation's fate, that person becomes your political idol. And 30 years later, when you're the one in power, you set about fulfilling that idol's vision. That's the true source of the 30-year cycle. Here's how it plays out with real American presidents. 1901, Teddy Roosevelt enters the White House at 42. He's a battle-hardened progressive. He busts trusts, protects national parks, picks fights with big capital. Watching him during those years, right in their adolescent political awakening window, is a generation of young Americans. One of them is a distant cousin named Franklin Roosevelt. FDR is not yet 20. 1933. FDR enters the White House and launches a New Deal. That audacious, roll up your sleeves and build something spirit is essentially FDR spending his entire presidency trying to be the Teddy Roosevelt he idolized as a teenager. FDR governed for 12 years. In that time, a new generation of young Americans is set on fire. 2 of them are named John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. 1961. Kennedy enters the White House and announces the new frontier. At its core, it's a New Deal reborn, because it's Kennedy spent his presidency trying to be the FDR he idolized as a boy. After Kennedy's assassination, Johnson takes over and launches a Great Society, essentially a turbocharged New Deal. 3 generations, 3 waves of public purpose, 30-year intervals, each one precise. Every time a generation reaches power, it does the same thing. It cashes in the check that its teenage idol wrote for it. That's how the pendulum swings. Now, why is this tension so vivid in America specifically? Why are the 2 sides so evenly matched? Because both were written into America's political DNA on the very first day by 2 founding generation minds in direct opposition to each other, and neither one ever convinced the other. That's the Hamilton-Jefferson debate. Hamilton believed America needed to do great things: a national bank, industrial policy, protective tariffs. Use the power of the state to transform an agricultural frontier into an industrial powerhouse. Jefferson believed America should be a paradise for small farmers, every man tending his own vineyard and fig tree, free and undisturbed. Government should be as small as possible, as far from ordinary life as possible. What he feared most was the expansion of central power. In his eyes, Hamilton's strong government vision was simply a scheme to let bankers and merchants ride on the backs of ordinary people. These are the intellectual and institutional origins of public purpose versus private interest. And from Hamilton and Jefferson forward, neither side ever stopped competing. That's why you can't permanently suppress either one. Both have incredibly deep roots. Both have their sacred texts, their heroes, their traditions. The public purpose side has its icons, the Roosevelt family. The private interest side has its icons, Andrew Jackson, who in some ways looks like a forerunner of Trump. When both sides have such rich ancestral lineages, neither can crush the other. The pendulum keeps swinging. Now, is that evenly matched tension actually a good thing? Schlesinger himself doesn't think so. At least, he doesn't try to be neutral about it. He served in Kennedy's White House. Kennedy is the ultimate public purpose president, and it shows. When Schlesinger writes about public purpose periods, there's real emotion in it. How the New Deal saved America, how Kennedy summoned a generation. But when he writes about private interest periods, he's practically dripping with sarcasm. He lists scandal after scandal from private interest presidents, and at one point actually suggests that politicians pursuing public goals are less prone to corruption, which feels a little politically naive. So let me try to be more balanced. Public purpose. Its strengths we've covered. It can tackle systemic problems that markets can't handle alone. But its fatal flaw is that it requires mass mobilization, and mass mobilization always suppresses pluralism. Once everyone enters let's do this together mode, anyone who won't join becomes an obstacle. FDR in 1937, frustrated that the Supreme Court kept striking down his New Deal programs, tried to pack the court with his own appointees, a serious assault on the separation of powers. The FBI under Kennedy surveilled dissidents at a staggering scale. When public purpose goes unchecked, this is what it looks like. It also has a natural appetite for expanding government power. Power seized is hard to return. FDR broke precedent and ran for a third term, then a fourth, which is why America later passed a constitutional amendment capping presidents at 2 terms. LBJ lied to Congress and the public for years about Vietnam. These are the symptoms of public purpose without restraint. Private interest has virtues Schlesinger barely mentions. First, it's the soil in which American innovation grows. Silicon Valley didn't emerge from FDR's administrative agencies. It grew in the atmosphere of Eisenhower and Reagan, that everyone go get rich energy. Second, it naturally resists authoritarianism. Government stay out of my business has a built-in logic that makes it very hard to slide toward totalitarianism. The countries that fell into fascism and militarism in the 20th century were precisely the ones that lacked this powerful tradition of "don't you dare tell me what to do." So each side can be medicine or poison. America's fortune may never have been that one side won. It's that neither side could win permanently, that the other side always pulled it back in time. Now let's look at the 2 backseat passengers, experimental America and providential America. These 2 aren't about which direction to drive. They're about what kind of nation America is in the first place. One says, America is a grand experiment. The other says, America is a nation chosen by God to fulfill divine destiny. Their conflict isn't about policy. It's about identity. Both go back to the very beginning. The earliest and most important wave of American immigrants were the Puritans. They brought the providential narrative. They believed they hadn't crossed the ocean as refugees. God had specifically chosen them to build a city upon a hill on this new continent, a moral exemplar for fallen Europe, a lighthouse for all humanity. That phrase, city upon a hill, comes from the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew. Puritan leader John Winthrop used it in a sermon in 1630. The meaning, we are going to build something so morally pure so magnificent that the whole world will look up to us. This idea is older than the United States itself. It was at the moment Puritan feet touched North American soil. Meanwhile, the early American intellectual elite was deeply shaped by the Enlightenment. They brought the experimental tradition. They believed America was a high-stakes political experiment. No king, no divine sanction, just a piece of paper binding millions of strangers into a republic. Would it work? Genuinely unclear. Benjamin Franklin, walking out of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, was stopped by an old woman who asked him, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." Those words are drenched in uncertainty. We're running an experiment here. It might succeed. It might not. We'll see if you can hold it together. That's the spiritual DNA of experimental America. Both of these temperaments coexist in every generation of Americans. The archetypal experimentalists are the two Roosevelts. When FDR launched the New Deal, he said something that sounds less like statesmanship and more like startup culture. Take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. The core of the experimental temperament: humility, pragmatism, willingness to fail, readiness to course correct. The archetypal providentialists are Wilson and Reagan. Wilson in 1919. America is the only idealistic nation in the world. The heart of America is pure. The heart of America is unsullied. Reagan in 1982. I've always believed that this anointed land was set apart in an uncommon way, that a divine plan placed this great continent here between the oceans to be found by people from every corner of the earth. That's not political speech. That's a sermon. How do these passengers relate to the drivers? Schlesinger says the providential experimental axis doesn't really participate in the 30-year cycle. The cycle is driven by the front seat dynamics. But the passengers absolutely influence the style of driving. You can head in the public purpose direction with Roosevelt's experimental trial and error spirit. Or you can head in the same direction with Wilson's "we have been chosen by God and cannot fail" energy. FDR's approach. When the Supreme Court struck down his National Recovery Administration, he pivoted, launched Social Security, launched the Works Progress Administration. Extraordinarily flexible. Wilson's approach. At the Paris Peace Conference, he refused to yield an inch. Back home, he fought the Senate to the death over the League of Nations Treaty, until he had a stroke and still refused to step down, convinced only he could complete God's assignment for him. The treaty was voted down. Wilson's political career ended in ruin. Same direction. Completely different spirit. Completely different result. Schlesinger is starkly biased here, too. He's almost entirely on the experimental side, and he spends enormous amounts of the book attacking providentialism as naive and dangerous. But I think, again, the balance matters. The experimental temperament has clear virtues: pragmatism, humility, willingness to correct mistakes, all obviously good. But it has a fatal weakness. It can't give people meaning. Human beings don't run on pure reason. A purely experimental politics works fine in calm times, but in a crisis, it can't move people. It can't summon collective will. Imagine FDR at his 1933 inauguration saying, "I have 3 plans to address the Depression. We'll try plan a first. If GDP doesn't rise 5% in 6 months, we'll switch to plan B." America would have collapsed on the spot. What he actually said was, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." That is textbook providentialism. Even the most experimental of presidents needs to flip into providential mode when everything is on the line. And there's a second weakness. Pure experimentalism can be dangerously short-sighted. Abolishing slavery, women's suffrage, the moon landing. None of these make sense from a straightforward cost-benefit analysis. They require a kind of stubborn, slightly irrational faith. This is our destiny, even if it takes generations. Pure experimentalism doesn't produce that faith, and exactly where experimentalism falls short, providentialism fills in. Only a providentialist could stand at Gettysburg in 1863, the darkest hour of the Civil War, and say, "That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." No data, No feasibility study. Just a pure conviction. We will not fail. If Lincoln had been purely experimental in that moment, he might have cut a deal with the Confederacy. But he didn't, and America survived. That's partly because Lincoln, in that moment, was a providentialist. Of course, providentialism has its own serious problem. If I'm fulfilling divine destiny, then you must be working against it, which makes providentialism prone to arrogance, intolerance of dissent, and walking itself into dead ends. Wilson stroked out mid-crusade. George W. Bush couldn't stop the Iraq War. These are the prices providentialism pays for its hubris. So, ideally, experimentalism handles day-to-day governance, corrects mistakes, prevents extremes. Providentialism handles the defining moments, the mobilizations, the big-picture direction. That division of labor works. And America's fortune is that both temperaments have always been present. The experimentalist keeps pulling the providentialist back from the edge. The providentialist keeps pushing the experimentalist forward when the moment demands it. Now, let's bring it all together and ask the question that actually matters. Does this still hold today? Schlesinger wrote this book in 1986. At the end, he made a prediction that history could test. The 1990s, he said, should open a new wave of public purpose. Looking back 40 years later, he was half right, the correct half. In 1992, Bill Clinton won the presidency. Clinton was born in 1946, right in the Kennedy era. He was politically formed by JFK. In 1963, at just 16 years old, Clinton was received by Kennedy at the White House as a delegate from Arkansas. He later used that footage, a teenage boy shaking hands with the president, repeatedly in his campaign ads, deliberately casting himself as Kennedy's political heir. Perfect fit. Kennedy's White House, 1961. Clinton's White House, 1992. 31 years. The cycle holds. But 2 years in 1994, Newt Gingrich and the Republicans swept the midterms and buried Clinton's public purpose revival before it could really take hold. Clinton spent the rest of his presidency drifting toward private interest. He declared the era of big government over. He signed welfare reform. He championed free trade. That's not Kennedy's child. That's Reagan's child. And after 2000, the pattern gets stranger. Bush to Obama, to Trump to Biden to Trump again, each shift more violent than the last, each reversal happening in 4 to 8 years, not 30. Has the mechanism broken down, or just been temporarily disrupted? In the 1999 preface to a new edition, Schlesinger offered some explanations. The most convincing one: the amplitude of the swings has grown. His argument: the 1960s public purpose wave went too far. Vietnam, radical student movements, counterculture, racial upheaval, the sexual revolution, all layered on top of each other. The shadow that wave cast over American life was so deep that the private interest reaction had to be almost equally powerful to compensate. So starting with Reagan in 1981, America entered a super extended private interest period, one that I would argue ran all the way to 2008, 28 years, long enough to cover an entire cycle. Clinton's 8 years in the middle, the public purpose current was supposed to surge back then, but the underlying social mood was still private interest. The current couldn't build enough momentum. Schlesinger died in 2007. He didn't live to see what came next. But I have a theory. The 1960s public purpose wave was launched by 2 triggering events. First, Vietnam, which made Americans ask, what are we actually doing in the world? Second, the civil rights movement, which made Americans ask, is our own country actually just? 2 massive moral questions, arriving together, summoning the wave. Now look at how the Obama era began. 2 triggering events, almost identical in structure. First, the Iraq War, the new Vietnam, making Americans ask the same questions about empire and mission. Second, the 2008 financial crisis, making Americans ask whether everyone for themselves was still workable. 2 events, same template, summoning Obama. My read: Obama was a delayed Kennedy child. And once he took office, the public purpose wave surged, this time with real force. The Affordable Care Act, the biggest public investments in Social Security. Marriage equality, the biggest social transformation since the Civil Rights Act. Minority rights elevated to unprecedented prominence, including the Black Lives Matter movement. Climate and environmental policy on an ambitious scale. And because this wave had been suppressed for nearly 50 years, held back since the 1960s, when it finally broke, in some dimensions it went further than the 1960s ever did. The 1960s was about sexual liberation and equal rights. The core demand, let us join. The core method, challenge the existing social order. The 2010s became something more radical. Identity politics, organizing people by race and gender into categories of oppressor and victim. Cancel culture, demands not just for inclusion in the game, but for dismantling the game's underlying structure entirely. This went further than the 60s. And because the public purpose wave went further, the private interest backlash was stronger. That's Trump. That's MAGA. At its root, Trump is an enormous pendulum rebound, the scale of which left the entire world speechless. So my read is, the pendulum hasn't broken. It's still swinging. But the amplitude has grown, and the frequency has accelerated, from an elegant 30-year cycle into a violent high-frequency oscillation. But that's not even the deepest problem. I think the more alarming thing is what's happened to those two backseat passengers. They're no longer any experimentalists. Both sides are now providentialists. The right-wing providentialism is obvious. Make America great again. That's pure providential narrative, no explanation needed. But what many people miss is that the left became providentialist first. Over the past decade or more, left-wing politics has increasingly reached for language like, the arc of history bends toward justice. Progress is inevitable. History is on our side. And the corollary, don't end up on the wrong side of history. Meaning, anyone who disagrees is a reactionary working against the inevitable tide. That framing, history is on our side, is just left-wing providentialism. Different costume, same theology. And I think providentialism is exactly what makes the pendulum dangerous when it replaces experimentalism on both sides. The experimental temperament says, my side might be wrong. If they break it, let them fix it. If we break it, we deserve to be replaced. It accepts that no one holds the final truth. It treats the other side as the next rotation in power, not as an existential enemy. But once both sides are providentialist, once both sides believe we are the righteous ones and history backs us up, nobody wants to concede. Nobody is willing to lose. Every election becomes a battle against evil, not a transfer of power between alternating governments. The other side isn't just wrong. They are a permanent threat to be destroyed. And when that happens, the pendulum stops swinging. It starts convulsing. The two front seat drivers are still arguing, still roughly evenly matched. Odds of the House flips back to Democrats in the next midterms. The equilibrium hasn't fully collapsed, but the arguments are getting uglier. Each side increasingly believes the other is destroying the car. The hands on the wheel are pulling harder and harder. You can almost hear it groaning. What I'd watch for is the day the argument stops. The day one side decides, since I alone carry divine destiny, you need to disappear. America's national fortune has always lived inside the noise of that endless, exhausting argument.